Can you imagine saying one sentence and watching it erase 12 years of your life? Those were the words I said to my son on a stormy night in Ohio. Get out. I was standing in a dry house with the heat on. He was 16 years old, holding a school backpack. No coat, no plan rain already soaking through his shoes. I told myself it was discipline. I told myself boys need consequences. I told myself a lie I heard was enough to judge the child I raised. 3 hours later, I sat at the kitchen table staring at my phone, convinced silence meant control. I did not know where he was sleeping. I did not know who would open a door for him. I only knew I had drawn a line and felt powerful doing it. 12 years passed. I am 52 now. Sitting in my truck outside a coffee shop in downtown Columbus, watching my grown son walk away from me like I am just another stranger in his day. He did not fail without me. He rose, and that is when I realized the sentence I thought would teach him a lesson had already taught me mine. If you think this story ends with forgiveness, you are wrong. The first thing I noticed when I stepped onto the porch was the smell of wet leaves and hot asphalt. It was late for a weeknight, the kind of late that makes the neighborhood feel like it has already gone to bed without you. The wind shoved rain sideways across the streetlights in our subdivision outside Columbus, and the maple in our front yard was bending like it wanted to tear itself out of the ground. I fumbled my keys because my hands were still numb from the crawl space I had spent the afternoon in. My work van sat at the curb with mud on the tires and a coil of flex duct sliding around in the back. HVAC is not the kind of job that lets you show up clean even when you try. Tonight, I did not try. I just wanted to get inside, kick off my boots, and pretend the world could not reach me for an hour. When I opened the door, the house was half lit. The power was flickering, not out, not on, like the whole grid was breathing through a straw. The kitchen light buzzed, went dim, came back. The hallway was shadowed. The air inside felt tighter than it should have, like someone had been holding their breath, waiting for me. Linda was at the table, hands wrapped around a mug she was not drinking. She looked up, and the look told me everything before she said a word. Not fear, not surprise, just that careful stillness she wore when she did not want something to explode. Ethan was in the living room, standing instead of sitting, like he had been pacing and got caught. 16 and tall, already shoulders still a little too narrow for the body he was growing into. He had a backpack on the floor by the couch, zipped ready. That detail should have warned me, but I was already carrying a different story in my head. Jason was on the stairs, one hand around the banister, peeking like he was watching a movie he was not supposed to see. 12 years old and quiet eyes wide, trying to read which version of me had walked through the door. I shut it behind me. The latch clicked loud in the silence. Linda said my name softly. Daniel. I did not answer. I hung my wet jacket on the back of a chair and stood there with my boots still on water pooling on the entry rug. My phone felt heavy in my pocket, the call from earlier still ringing in my ears. Mark Reynolds had called me just before I left the last job. Mark ran the branch down on Sawmill Road, the kind of guy who always sounded like he was smiling, even when he was giving you bad news. We knew each other from church and from the times I had to hustle a payroll deposit in before 5. He said, Dan, I am not trying to get in your business, but I saw something today. Your boy came in asking questions about cashing a check, and there was talk at the counter. Something about missing money at the school, and his name came up. I asked him if he was sure. Mark hesitated, then said it like he was doing me a favor. I am not saying he did it, but you might want to get ahead of it. Get ahead of it. The words men use when they do not want to say the thing they are thinking. All the way home I held that story like a tool in my hand, solid and familiar. Ethan in trouble. Ethan and his mouth, Ethan and his attitude. Ethan always pushing, always testing. I had been telling myself for months that he needed a hard lesson. That was the story I wanted. I walked into the living room and looked at him. My voice came out calm, which is what scared me later when I replayed it in my head. Where were you after school? Ethan swallowed. At the library. I nodded once. You want to try that again? He blinked like he did not know which part of reality I had already decided. Dad, I was at the library. I have a test tomorrow. Linda set the mug down. Daniel, please. I held up a hand without looking at her. Ethan, did you take money from the office at school? His face changed fast. Not guilt exactly, more like shock that I could ask something that big. No. What are you talking about? I stepped closer. Then explain why Mark Reynolds says your name is coming up at the bank and why your mother tells me there is cash missing from my desk drawer. Linda flinched. She did not deny it. That should have mattered, but all I heard was confirmation. Cash missing. Bank. School. It fit together too neatly, and I treated that neatness like proof. Ethan looked from me to his mom. I did not take anything. I do not even know what you are talking about. I felt something hot crawl up my neck. Not rage, something worse, disappointment dressed up as authority. I told you to stay out of trouble. I told you I will not have this in my house. Jason made a small sound on the stairs, like he had inhaled too sharply. Linda turned her head slightly, a warning to him to stay quiet. Ethan's hands were open at his sides. He looked older and younger at the same time. Dad, you are not listening. I heard myself answer before he finished. I am listening. I am listening to you lie to my face. The power flickered again. The kitchen light dimmed, and for a second the living room went more shadow than room. Rain slapped the windows. The house creaked like it was shifting under pressure. Linda stood up. Daniel, do not do this. Not tonight. I finally looked at her. If not tonight, then when? How many times do we excuse it until it becomes who he is? Ethan's jaw tightened. I did not do anything. Somebody is setting me up. You know that happens. You always say the world is not fair, and now you are doing this. I hated that he used my own words. I hated that it sounded like a smart argument, like he might be right, because if he was right, then I had a choice to make. And I had never been good at choices that required me to admit I could be wrong. I walked to the closet by the front door, pulled it open, and grabbed his coat. The brown one I had bought him at Meijer when winter hit early the year before. I tossed it toward him. It landed half on the couch, half on the floor. Get your things. Get out. Linda gasped. Daniel. Ethan stared at me like he was waiting for the punchline that did not come. His voice was quieter when he spoke again. You cannot mean that. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam a fist on the wall. I just repeated it steady as a rule. Get out. Not another word. Not another excuse. If you are going to live like this, you are not doing it under my roof. Jason slid down one step without meaning to. Linda turned and put her hand out behind her, stopping him. Ethan bent down and grabbed his backpack. His hands shook as he zipped it, and that small human detail almost cracked something in me. Almost. But I swallowed it, because men like me swallow things. We call it strength. He pulled on the coat, the sleeves too short now. He stood at the door, breathing hard, eyes glossy, but not crying. He looked at his mother. Linda's mouth opened, then closed. Her eyes were wet, but she did not move. Then he looked at me. I expected anger. I expected a curse. What I got was a long, steady look, like he was trying to memorize my face for evidence. "Okay," he said. His voice was flat, controlled in a way that made me feel like I was the kid and he was the adult. "Okay, if that is what you want." He opened the door. Wind and rain rushed in like an animal. For a second, the porch light flickered and made him look like a ghost in the doorway. Then he stepped out. I closed the door behind him. The latch clicked again, final and clean. For a moment I stood with my hand still on the knob, listening to the storm swallow the sound of his footsteps. The house felt warmer without the open door, quieter without his voice, and I told myself that quiet was order. Linda did not speak. Jason did not move. The kitchen light buzzed and steadied. Rain hammered the windows, and somewhere in the neighborhood, a tree limb snapped. I walked back into the living room, sat down like a man finishing a hard job, and tried not to think about how small the backpack had looked on his shoulders as he stepped into the dark. The next morning, I woke before my alarm, the way you do after you have crossed a line and your body refuses to pretend it was normal. Rain still rattled the gutters, softer now, like the storm was embarrassed by how loud it had been the night before. I lay there listening for sounds that were not coming. No footsteps in the hallway. No cabinet doors in the kitchen. No music leaking from Ethan's room. Linda moved beside me, careful as if the bed itself might crack. She sat up slowly and looked toward the door. When she spoke, her voice was thin. He did not come back. I stared at the ceiling and forced my lungs to work. He will be fine, I said, and I believed it because I needed to. He has friends. He will cool off. He will think about what he did. Linda did not answer. She got up, pulled on a sweatshirt, and left the room. I told myself that quiet was what I had wanted. For months, the house had felt like it was always one wrong word away from a blow-up. Ethan and I had been circling each other, two rams in a pen too small. Every argument started about one thing and ended about everything. Respect, attitude, responsibility. I started to think peace was simply the absence of his voice. Downstairs, the kitchen light was steady again. The power had held. Linda stood at the sink with her hands in soapy water, staring at nothing. Jason was at the table with cereal spoon paused halfway, watching her like he was waiting for permission to swallow. I poured coffee and sat across from him. He looked older than 12 in that moment, like the house had aged him overnight. "Is Ethan in trouble?" he asked. I stirred sugar into my cup until it disappeared. "Ethan made some choices," I said. "He needs to understand there are consequences." Jason nodded the way kids do when they want to be on the right side of things. He did not ask if Ethan was coming back. Maybe he was afraid of the answer. Maybe he was relieved in a way he did not understand. Linda set a plate of eggs on the table, then sat without eating. She kept her eyes on her hands. "You did not even let him explain," she said, not accusing, just stating a fact so quiet, it felt like it could be ignored. I looked at her. I did let him explain. He lied. "You do not know," that she said, and then she pressed her lips together like she had said too much. I could have argued. I could have asked why she had not stopped me if she felt that way. Instead, I took the easier road, the road I was already committed to. What I know is, this house is not a place where you take what is not yours and blame the world, I said. Linda's shoulders sagged. She stood up again and went back to the sink. Water ran, dishes clinked. The conversation ended the way it always ended, when she did not want it to turn into a war. By mid-morning, I was back in my van driving toward a call in Dublin, hands tight on the wheel. I told myself work was the responsible thing. People needed heat, and I had bills, and the world did not stop because my family was a mess. That story had the benefit of being true and convenient. All day I kept thinking my phone would ring. Ethan would call apologizing, asking to come home, promising to straighten up. That is what I expected, because it would prove I was right. Each time my phone buzzed with a new job request or a supplier message, I felt a sharp disappointment that I tried to mask as irritation. That first week, the silence felt like a room I could finally breathe in. No slammed bedroom door. No sarcastic comments. No debate about curfew or grades or the tone he used when he said my name. In the evenings when I came home, Jason was already at the table doing homework. Linda moved around the kitchen like a ghost, making dinner, cleaning, making the same meals she always made, as if routine could stitch the house back together. Jason started talking more. Small things. His day at school. A joke a friend told. He asked me about the van, about how furnaces work, about whether he could come with me on a Saturday call. I said yes before I even thought about it. It felt good being needed without being challenged. It felt good to be the kind of father a kid admired. One night, 2 days after I told Ethan to leave, Linda mentioned his name and then stopped like it burned her tongue. "Should we call his friends?" she asked. "He will reach out if he needs us," I said. She stared at me, and for a second, I thought she might say something that would force me to look at the ground under my feet. Instead, she nodded once and went to fold laundry. The same pattern. Avoid the fight. Keep the house standing. On the third day, my phone buzzed while I was in the driveway unloading tools. I saw Ethan's name on the screen and felt my pulse jump in a way that made me angry at myself. I wiped my hands on my work pants and opened the message. "Dad, I need to explain. Please." I did not take anything. "I have proof. Just give me a chance to talk. I can come by tonight or we can meet somewhere. Please." I read it once, then again. The words "have proof" sat there like a stone. My first instinct was to reply with a time and a place. The second instinct was darker. If I answered, I would have to listen. If I listened, I might have to admit I had made a mistake. And if I admitted that, what did that make me? I stood in the driveway with the garage door open, cold air pouring out, my tools scattered on the concrete like a scene from a life I could still control. Linda was watching from the kitchen window. Jason's laughter drifted from the living room where he was playing a video game. I typed a response. "Not now, we will talk later." Then I erased it. I typed something harsher, something about responsibility and consequences. I erased that too. Finally, I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. I told myself I was being strong. I told myself a father cannot fold the first time a kid cries. I told myself Ethan was manipulating me because he did not like boundaries. I told myself every story that would let me keep my spine straight. Linda came out to the garage a few minutes later. She did not ask what the message said. She did not need to. "He texted you," she said. "Yes. And you did not answer." "Not yet." She looked past me at the street rainwater still flowing toward the storm drain. "Daniel, he is 16. He is also old enough to know better," I said, and the words came out like a script I had memorized. Linda's eyes filled, but she blinked it back. She did not fight. She just went back inside, and I stood there feeling like I had won something and lost something in the same breath. Over the next couple of weeks, I took more work. I told myself it was because winter was coming, and everyone wanted their systems checked. The truth was, I could not stand being in the house when it was too quiet. Quiet left room for questions. I started accepting calls late into the evening, the kind of jobs other guys turned down. A rattling blower motor on the far side of town. A thermostat issue in a strip mall in Hilliard. A no-heat call from an older couple in Worthington who kept apologizing for bothering me after hours. I smiled and told them it was fine because it was easier to be kind to strangers than to face the damage at home. Jason loved that I was around, more even if I was exhausted. He would wait up some nights sitting on the couch, pretending to watch TV until I came in. He would ask if I fixed it, and I would say yes, and he would grin like I had saved the world. Linda moved through her days like she was carrying something heavy she did not want anyone else to see. She paid bills, she did the grocery run, she drove Jason to practice. She did not mention Ethan, but sometimes I caught her standing at the front window at dusk looking down the street, as if a familiar figure might appear. I told myself Ethan had somewhere to go. Friends, relatives, somebody. I told myself he would learn. I told myself this was how boys became men, but the house kept score in its own way. Ethan's shoes were still by the closet, the ones he wore when he mowed lawns. A half-finished model car sat on his desk in his room, the tiny parts spread out like he might come back any second to finish it. His baseball glove was tucked behind the dresser. I did not touch any of it. Linda did not either. It was like we were afraid that moving his things would make the absence permanent. Late one night after a long job that had me crawling under a restaurant rooftop unit in the freezing wind, I came home to find a letter on the kitchen counter. It was addressed to Ethan, sent to our house with his name written in the sharp block handwriting of a school office. I set it down and stared at it, feeling the old anger and something else underneath it. Linda looked up from the table. "What is it?" "School mail," I said. Her eyes widened. "Daniel, open it. It is not mine. It is coming here for a reason," she said, and her voice shook for the first time in days. I picked up the envelope and held it. The paper was damp at the edges from the mailbox, and it felt heavier than it should have. I stood there staring at Ethan's name, thinking about his message, thinking about the word proof, thinking about the way he had looked at me in the doorway. I did not open it yet. I just stood with it in my hand, listening to the refrigerator hum, listening to the house settle, and wondering what I would find inside. My thumb slid under the flap, and the envelope tore with a soft, ripping sound that felt too loud in the kitchen. Linda watched me like she was afraid the paper might bite. Inside was a single sheet from the school office printed on plain letterhead. Attendance. A required meeting. Language about an incident under review. The words were careful and clean, the way institutions talk when they do not want to be sued. Ethan's name was there in black ink, and beneath it, a date that sat like a nail in my chest. I read it twice before my brain accepted what my eyes were seeing. The meeting was scheduled for the afternoon. I had been in a crawl space on the north side. It said he had been asked to come in to answer questions about missing funds and a complaint from another student. It did not say guilty. It did not say thief. It did not say liar. It said under review. Linda whispered, "Daniel." I stared at the page as if staring harder could make it confess to something. My mouth was dry. So they really did talk about him. They talked about him, Linda said, and her voice carried something sharp for the first time in weeks. Talking about a kid is not the same as proving anything. I wanted to say Mark would not have called me if it was nothing. I wanted to say a father knows. I wanted to say the world does not hand you warnings twice. Instead, I folded the paper and set it on the table like it might burn through my skin. I told myself I could still fix it. I told myself Ethan would come home when he was ready, and then we would handle the school mess together, like men like a family. But that night passed, and then another. I did not learn what Ethan went through in those first days until years later, and even then I only got pieces, small facts people let slip, details that floated up when you least wanted them. The kind of details that lodge in your throat. The first night, he did not have a plan. I know that now. 16-year-old boys talk big, but when a door closes behind them and the storm is real, they are still boys. He went to a friend's house first, a kid from his algebra class, who lived in a split level near the high school. Ethan knocked on the door, soaked through backpack, pressed to his chest like a shield. The friend's mom opened the door, saw the rain, saw Ethan's face, and let him in for an hour. She gave him a towel. She gave him hot chocolate. Then she made a call. Not to me. To someone else, and maybe a relative, maybe a boyfriend, maybe a sister. The point was, she did what adults do. She protected her own household. Ethan was back outside before midnight. He tried another friend, then another. Doors that did not open. Lights that did not come on. A phone that buzzed with excuses. Sorry, man. My dad said, no sorry. We got company, sorry. The apologies got shorter as the hour got later. By dawn, he was sitting in my old Honda in the parking lot, behind a 24-hour grocery on Bethel Road, the car I had bought for him to learn on, and then kept because he never got the chance. It was not really his, not legally, not in the way the world counts things. But it had been parked in the driveway, and he had grabbed the keys from the hook by the door before I could think to stop him. That detail is what still makes me sick. He did not take my money. He did not take a TV. He took the only thing that could keep him from freezing. I learned that part from a tow notice that showed up weeks later after the car got tagged for sitting too long. The paper had a storage fee printed at the bottom. The system never forgets. The system just keeps adding numbers. On the third day, he showed up at Tom Alvarez's shop. Tom's place sat behind a row of warehouses on the west side, a squat building with a faded sign, and a parking lot full of old pickups. The kind of shop that smells like oil and metal and sweat. I had met Tom once years earlier when a furnace motor I needed was on back order, and he helped me rig something temporary. He was not a warm man. He was fair, and there is a difference. Ethan walked in and asked if they needed a hand. He did not say he was hungry. He did not say he had been kicked out. He asked for work like his pride was the last thing he owned. Tom looked him over and asked how old he was. 16, Ethan said. Tom asked if he could lift 50 pounds and show up on time. Yes, sir. Tom told him to sweep the shop and take out the trash. $5 an hour cash for the first day. No promises. Ethan did it until his arms shook. He swept under benches, dragged heavy bins, scrubbed grease off concrete. Tom did not praise him. He did not pat him on the back. He just watched the way men like that watch, waiting to see if a kid quits when no one is looking. Ethan did not quit. After a week, Tom bumped him up and put him on simple tasks. Holding a flashlight, fetching tools, breaking down boxes, cleaning parts. The pay was still low, but it was pay. It was proof you could trade effort for survival. Ethan took that proof and stretched it. He rented a room in a house off Henderson, the kind of place where the landlord does not ask questions as long as the money shows up. A mattress on the floor. A dresser with a missing handle. A window that rattled when trucks passed. No shame. Just a roof. When he got his first full week's pay, he folded the bills and held them for a long time before he spent a single dollar. I know that because Tom told me later, years later, in a voice that carried respect he probably did not realize he was offering. Your boy did not blow it on stupid things, Tom said. He bought work gloves. He bought a bus pass for backup. He bought a used coat when the weather turned. He acted like a man who knew nobody was coming to save him. While Ethan was learning how to stay upright, I was still telling myself I had done the saving. I filled my days with calls and furnaces and invoice totals. At home, I drifted into the garage more than I needed to opening drawers that did not need opening, moving tools that already had a place. One evening, I found Ethan's old coat on a hook by the workbench, the brown one I had thrown at him that night. It must have come off his shoulders when he grabbed his backpack, must have been left behind in the scramble. The sleeves were still too short for him, the cuffs frayed. I should have taken it inside, washed it, put it in his room, a sign that he could come back. Instead, I left it there like an accusation I was not ready to face. Linda came into the garage and saw me standing with my hand on the coat. She did not say anything. She just looked at me, and in that look I saw what my silence had cost her too. The weeks turned into months. Ethan kept working at the shop. He kept his head down at school until the year ended. Then he stopped going. That part hit me hardest when I finally learned it. Not because he was lazy, but because he was forced to choose survival over the version of childhood I thought he was wasting. He did not drift, though. He found a night program through a local career center classes that taught practical skills with real certifications. He registered with cash he had earned, stood in a hallway full of older men and a few tired women, and wrote his name on a clipboard like it was a contract with his future. The first night he walked into that classroom, he was still 16, still a kid, but he sat up straight and took notes like nobody had ever given him anything for free. I did not know any of that then. That is the part that keeps me awake when I let myself remember. Back then, all I knew was the house was quiet, my phone stayed mostly still, and a boy I told myself needed discipline was learning a different kind of lesson out in the world. A lesson I did not teach him. And somewhere in that city under fluorescent lights, my son was signing up for a life that did not include me. Years passed the way they do when you keep your head down and let routine do the shoving. The calendar kept flipping. The city kept building new shopping centers, and my van kept collecting miles. I told myself time would smooth the sharp edges of that night. Instead, it just packed dirt over everything, like a man burying trash in the backyard and calling it clean. By 2015, Ethan was no longer a rumor at the edge of my life. He was a fact I avoided naming. Linda still did not say his name unless she had to, and when she did, it came out small, like she was testing the room for landmines. Jason grew taller, louder, more confident in the space Ethan used to take up. I let that happen because it was easier to be a father to a boy who wanted your approval than to face the one you had thrown away. I did not know all the steps Ethan took not then. I learned pieces later from people who had watched him work from papers that surfaced from a truth that never arrives all at once. But I know what the system does to you when you are trying to enter it without a family behind you. It does not care how young you were when you got hurt. It only asks if you can prove you belong. Ethan left Tom Alvarez's shop after a couple of years, not because Tom ran him off, but because the ceiling was low there. Tom taught him the value of showing up, the value of shutting up and doing the job. But there was only so far you could go sweeping floors and turning wrenches for cash. Ethan wanted steady pay, benefits, a path. He applied for a maintenance position at a warehouse off the Beltway, one of those places that runs day and night with pallets and scanners and forklifts weaving like insects. The job posting sounded simple. In reality, it came with paperwork that felt like a warning. Background check authorization, drug test, proof of identity, proof of address, proof of education. At 16, Ethan did not have much proof of anything except that he could keep moving. He still did it. He filled out the forms, He stood in line. He waited while adults in clean polos called him by a number. He signed his name so many times it must have felt like he was trying to convince the world he existed. That was where Rachel Kim came in. I never met her, not then. I only heard her name later when Linda mentioned it like she was reciting a prayer. She said Ethan had met a lawyer, someone who helped him understand what he was signing and what rights he had. A labor attorney, not the kind you call when you want to sue somebody for drama, but the kind you call when you cannot afford to be naive. Rachel did not rescue him. She taught him how not to get crushed. She told him to keep copies of everything. Offer letters, timesheets, pay stubs, text messages from supervisors. If a manager promised overtime, get it in writing. If a schedule changed, take a picture. If someone tried to make you work off the clock, do not argue, just document. Ethan listened, because Ethan had already learned that no one listens to a kid with no leverage. Records were leverage. He started carrying a cheap folder in his backpack. Later, it became a small filing box in whatever room he was renting. Paperwork stacked like bricks. Proof he was building something. Proof he could not be erased. The world does not care, but it keeps score. I know that because I lived in my own version of it. When business was good, people called me sir and paid on time. When business was slow, they acted like I was lucky to get a check. The difference was I always had a home to go back to. Ethan did not. He was learning the game without a safety net, and every mistake would cost him more than it cost me. Some nights after a long job, I would sit in my van outside a gas station, looking at the glow of the pump lights on wet pavement, and I would think about his hands. I would imagine him signing those forms. I would imagine him standing in a line of grown men, trying to look like he belonged. I would feel a small tug of pride, and then I would shut it down, because pride led to questions, and questions led back to my front door on that stormy night. By then, my house had its own rules. Linda and I moved around each other like roommates. We did not fight, but we did not touch much either. Jason was busy with school and friends, and he liked being the center of my attention. I took him on weekend calls sometimes. He would hand me screws, hold a flashlight, ask me why a furnace made a certain sound. I gave him the answers because giving answers is easier than admitting you do not have them. One Sunday in early fall, I drove to church alone. Linda said she had a headache, which was her way of saying she could not pretend. Jason stayed home too. I sat in my usual pew and listened to hymns that landed on me like a weight. I watched other families and tried not to count who was missing from mine. Pastor William Grant caught me after the service. He was 60, then gray hair cut neat, the kind of man who could look you in the eye without challenging you. He shook my hand and asked how work was going. Small talk. Safe talk. I did not know why I said it. Maybe it was the quiet in the house. Maybe it was the way the hymns had dug under my ribs. Maybe it was simply that I was tired of holding the story by myself. I told him my son had left. Pastor Grant did not widen his eyes. He did not gasp. He did not perform sympathy. He nodded like he already knew, because in a town like ours, someone always knows. He asked, "How did that happen, Daniel?" I said it was complicated. I said there was a lie. I said I had to draw a line. I said my son needed to learn consequences. The words came out smooth, like I had been rehearsing them for years, because I had. Pastor Grant listened without interrupting. When I finished, he did not tell me I was right. He did not tell me I was wrong. He tilted his head slightly and asked one question that hit harder than any accusation. Do you want to be right, or do you want to be his father? I stood there in the church hallway with the smell of coffee and old carpet in the air, and I could not answer. My throat tightened. My hands felt too big for my arms. I tried to laugh it off. I tried to say those things were the same. He did not let me. Being right feels clean, he said. Being a father is messy. I left the church with that sentence sitting on my chest like a brick. In the parking lot, the sun was bright, the kind of bright that makes you squint and pretend everything is fine. I sat in my truck and stared at the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. That week, I found myself staring at my phone more than I ever had. Not because it rang, but because it did not. I scrolled past Ethan's old text thread. The last message was still there, the one where he said he had proof. I had never answered. It looked worse with every passing year, like a stain that does not fade. At home, I walked into the garage and looked at the brown coat on the hook. Dust had settled on the shoulders. I brushed it off with my palm, a small act that meant nothing and everything. That night, while Linda was folding laundry, I asked her careful as if I was stepping onto thin ice. "Do you ever hear from him?" Linda stopped folding. She kept her eyes on the towel in her hands. "Sometimes," she said. "Not much. He is busy. Busy doing what I asked." She hesitated, and in that hesitation I heard a boundary. Then she spoke anyway. "He has a steady job now. He is doing well. He is not asking for anything." The words should have comforted me. Instead, they opened a hollow place inside my chest. Doing well, not asking for anything. A son who did not need his father. I went to bed that night with Pastor Grant's question repeating in my head. Do you want to be right? Or do you want to be his father? I stared into the dark and realized I had built an entire life around being right. Somewhere out there, Ethan was building an entire life around not needing me. I tried to tell myself that was just what sons did. They grew up, they moved on, they built lives that did not revolve around their parents. But there was a difference between a son growing up and a son growing out of you like you were never part of the story. The first time I heard his name in a room full of adults, it was not Linda who told me. It was a guy named Stan Miller who owned a small plumbing outfit and liked to talk like every sentence was a deal closing. We were standing near the coffee urn at a breakfast meeting downtown, one of those local business gatherings where people hand out business cards and pretend they are not worried about next month. Stan slapped me on the shoulder, friendly, loud enough that everyone could hear. "Dan Brooks, HVAC, still keeping the city warm." I smiled and nodded, the habit of small talk doing the work for me. Stan leaned closer. "You know who I saw last week? Ethan Brooks, that your boy." My stomach tightened so fast it stole my breath. I kept my face still. I worked hard to keep my face still. I said, "I have not seen him in a while." Stan did not notice. He was already halfway into his story. Sharp kid. Quiet, but sharp. He was over at that logistics outfit, Franklin Distribution, talking with their operations folks. Heard he is moving up. Moving up. Like Ethan was a ladder someone else could climb. I nodded again, as if it was normal to hear your son's name from a stranger, like it was weather. I asked a few safe questions. "What did you mean you saw him? How did he look? Was he working there?" Stan shrugged. "I just ran into him. Seemed like he had his act together. Not like some of these young guys. He looked like he belonged in the room." I took a sip of coffee I could not taste. My hand shook just a little, the kind of shake nobody notices unless they are looking for it. After that, I started hearing his name in little corners of town. A supplier mentioned an Ethan at a warehouse who knew his stuff. A neighbor said she thought she saw him at a grocery store on Kenny Road. Linda kept her eyes on her laundry and did not add anything. Jason asked me why I was quiet at dinner. I told him I was tired. Jason was 20 by then, and in many ways he still moved through our house like a kid who expected someone to catch him. He was in community college taking classes he kept changing. He worked part-time at a sporting goods store, but never had enough money for gas. He left his shoes in the middle of the hallway. He forgot to take the trash out, unless I reminded him twice. None of it was criminal, none of it was evil, but it was soft. It was the kind of soft I used to complain Ethan was, and yet I kept Jason wrapped in a cushion, because that was easier than admitting I had been too hard on one son and too gentle with the other. One Saturday morning, Jason slept past 10 while I stood in the kitchen looking at the bills. The coffee maker gurgled. The house was quiet. I watched him shuffle in, wearing sweatpants, hair sticking up, eyes half closed. He opened the fridge and stared into it like it owed him answers. "What are you doing today?" I asked. He shrugged. "Might go see Trey. Might work on that resume." "You have been working on that resume for 3 months," I said, and I tried to keep it light. Jason grinned like everything in life was flexible. "It will get done." Ethan would have already been out the door. That thought came uninvited. I hated it because it sounded like judgment. Linda came in and set a stack of folded towels on the counter. She looked at Jason, then at me, then back at Jason. She did not say anything, but the silence between us had grown a language of its own. A week later, I got invited to a workforce networking event at the community college, something about trades and local employers. Normally, I would have skipped it. I do not like crowds. I do not like posturing. But Stan's voice was still in my head, and Pastor Grant's question was still in my chest, and I found myself putting on a clean button-down, like a man preparing for an inspection. The event was held in a gym that smelled like old varnish and fresh coffee. Booths were lined up along the walls. Men in company polos stood beside banners that promised careers and growth. Young people wandered around with printed resumes in their hands, eyes bright or nervous. I walked the perimeter at first, nodding at people I recognized. I shook hands. I gave out a few cards. I tried to act normal. Then I saw him. At first, I did not know it was him. That is the truth that hurts the most. I saw a young man in a dark jacket standing near a booth for Franklin Distribution. He was talking to a manager type, a man with a clipboard and a practiced smile. The young man's posture was calm. Shoulders back, hands steady, no fidgeting. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, the manager leaned in. That is what made my heart stutter. People do not lean in for boys. They lean in for men they respect. He turned slightly, and the overhead lights caught his face. The jawline, the eyes, the way he held his mouth when he was thinking. It hit me like a punch in the ribs. Ethan. He was taller than I remembered, broader through the shoulders. His hair was shorter, neat, like he had learned that presentation matters. He did not look angry. He did not look broken. He looked steady. For a second, I forgot where I was. The gym noise went thin. I could hear my own breathing, the squeak of my shoes on the floor. I started walking without deciding to. 3 steps. 4. Then he smiled at something the manager said, not a big smile, just a polite one, and I saw he had a wedding ring on his left hand. The ring stopped me, not because a ring is dramatic, but because it meant there were whole chapters of his life that had happened without me. There had been a proposal, a yes, a ceremony, maybe a father of the bride speech, maybe pictures. Ethan had stood somewhere and made vows, and I had not been invited. I had not even known. My throat tightened. My hands went cold. I could have walked up. I could have said his name. I could have apologized right there in the middle of the gym like some kind of public confession. But I did not. I stood behind a row of folding chairs and watched him for a few seconds like a coward. I told myself it was not the place. I told myself I would scare him off. I told myself he would not want to see me. I told myself 100 things that sounded responsible and were really fear. Ethan finished the conversation, shook the manager's hand, and moved down the line to another booth. He did not look around. He did not scan the room for me. He walked like a man who had learned to stop looking for doors that would not open. I took one step forward, and then he was swallowed by a cluster of people. I tried to find him again. Eyes darting, heart hammering, but the gym was full of dark jackets and short hair and young men carrying folders. He was gone. I left the event early. I walked out into the parking lot and stood beside my truck, staring at the windshield as if it might show me what to do next. The air was crisp, the kind of fall air that smells like dry grass and distant fireplaces. My hands shook when I unlocked the door. When I got home, Jason was on the couch with his feet up, laughing at something on his phone. He looked up when I came in. "How was it, Dad?" I could not answer right away. I stood there watching him, seeing the ease in his face, the comfort, the way he assumed the house would always be there for him. Linda came in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. She saw my face and went still. "You saw him," she said quietly. I nodded once. Her eyes searched mine. "Did you talk to him?" I swallowed. "No." Linda closed her eyes like she was bracing against a blow, then opened them again. She did not yell. She did not accuse. She just said the truth that landed like a weight. "Then you did not really want him back. You wanted to feel less guilty." That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing Ethan's voice in my head from 12 years earlier, the way he said he had proof. I thought about the ring on his finger, the steady way he carried himself, the way he did not even look for me. Somewhere between midnight and morning, I realized I could not hide behind being right forever. The world did not care about my excuses, but it kept score all the same, and I was finally starting to see what the numbers meant. The next day, I drove past the community college again, not because I had business there, but because my mind kept replaying the moment Ethan turned, and I did not know him. I kept seeing that ring on his hand, like a small flashlight aimed straight at my failure. At home, Linda moved around me like she was giving a wide berth to an animal that might snap. Jason stayed in his room longer than usual, headphones on, letting the house carry whatever tension I brought back with me. I tried to act normal. I checked the thermostat, made a grocery list in my head, watched the evening news without hearing a single word. But my body would not cooperate. Every quiet moment filled with the same question. What if I was wrong? That question is dangerous to a man who has built his life on certainty. In my world, you diagnose a furnace by symptoms, you fix what is broken, you move on. You do not sit on the basement steps wondering if your own hands caused the problem. I went into the garage and found the old folder where I kept paperwork I never looked at unless I had to. Service receipts, old insurance statements, a few school letters that Linda had tossed in there because I said I would handle them later. I pulled out the attendance notice from 2012, the one I had finally opened too late, and I stared at the date until the numbers blurred. Under review. Not guilty, not proven, under review. That phrase was the first crack in the story I told myself. The second crack came from memory. Not the kind of memory that flatters you, the kind that drags you by the collar. I remembered the way Ethan looked at me in the doorway. Not angry, not pleading. Studying me. Like he was realizing something about me that night. I remembered Linda's silence. Not agreement. Fear. The kind of fear that comes from knowing how hard it is to stop a man once he decides he is right. And I remembered Mark Reynolds's voice on the phone. He had hesitated. I had ignored the hesitation because I did not want caution. I wanted permission. 2 days after the event, I called Mark and asked if he had time to meet. I tried to keep my voice casual. Mark is the kind of guy who says buddy a lot and laughs to soften anything sharp. He told me to swing by the branch after lunch. The bank looked the same as it always did. Bright lights, clean tile, the smell of paper and carpet shampoo. Mark's office sat behind glass with framed photos of his kids and a plaque about customer service. He stood up when I walked in and shook my hand with both of his, like we were old friends and not men about to open a wound. "Daniel, good to see you," he said. "How is business?" "Fine," I said. Then I sat down and stared at my own hands. I did not trust my face. Mark leaned back in his chair. "So what can I do for you?" I took a breath. "I need to talk about something you told me a long time ago. About my son." Mark's smile faded a little. He glanced toward the glass wall like he wanted privacy, even though no one could hear us. He lowered his voice. "Ethan." I nodded. "Back in 2012 you called me. You said his name came up at the bank, something about missing money at school." Mark's eyes shifted just slightly, the way people look when they are searching for the safest path through a conversation. He cleared his throat. "Dan, that was a long time ago." "It was," I said. "But it mattered. It still matters." Mark spread his hands. "I was trying to help you." I leaned forward. "Were you sure? Did you actually see anything? A check, a withdrawal, anything tied to Ethan?" Mark blinked. "No. Not like that." My chest tightened. "Then what did you see?" He exhaled and rubbed his jaw. "There was a lady at the counter, I do not even remember her name. She was talking about something that happened at the school office. She said there was money missing, and she mentioned a kid, and Ethan's name came up. I asked a follow-up question, just trying to understand, and she said she thought it was him. That is all. That is all." The words landed like a heavy tool dropped on concrete. "So you did not know," I said. Mark's brow furrowed. "Dan, I told you I was not saying he did it. I told you you might want to get ahead of it. I never said I had proof. But you made it sound certain," I said, and my voice rose before I could stop it. "You made it sound like my son was already guilty." Mark's cheeks reddened. "I did not mean it that way." I stared at him. "You knew I was his father." Mark swallowed. "I was trying to be a good friend." A good friend. That word bounced around my skull like a loose screw. I sat back slowly, feeling the air leave my lungs in pieces. The room seemed smaller. The bright lights felt harsh. Mark kept talking softer now. "Dan, people talk. You know how it is. I heard something and I thought I should tell you. If I could go back, maybe I would do it differently. But at the time, I thought it was better you heard it from me than from somebody else." I nodded, but it was not agreement. It was my mind catching up to something my gut already knew. He had not handed me evidence. He had handed me smoke, and I had built a fire with it. On the drive home, I replayed that night again, but this time I forced myself to watch it like a stranger. Not the version where I was the strong father drawing a line. The version where I was tired, frustrated, scared of being made a fool, and hungry for control. I remembered the missing cash from my desk drawer. I remembered how quickly I believed it, how quickly I assumed Ethan had taken it. I never asked Linda when she first noticed it. I never asked if anyone else had been in the office where I kept my invoices and petty cash. I never checked my own habits. I kept cash in that drawer for years, sloppy about it, pulling a 20 here and there for gas or lunch, and forgetting what I had taken. It was possible nothing was missing at all. It was possible I was accusing a boy based on my own disorganization. And then there was the school. I never called. I never asked for a meeting. I never sat across from a counselor and listened. I heard a rumor, I heard a guess, and I treated it like a verdict because it fit the story I already wanted. At a stoplight near our neighborhood, I gripped the steering wheel until my fingers hurt. The truth was sitting right there, ugly and plain. No one forced me to throw my son out in a storm. I chose it. I chose the easier road. The road where I could feel decisive instead of confused. The road where I could punish a problem instead of understand it. The road where being right mattered more than being his father. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked ordinary. A porch swing, a trimmed hedge, the kind of place people point to and say, nice family. I sat in the truck for a long time before I went inside. Linda was in the kitchen cutting vegetables. She did not look up at first. When she saw my face, her hands stopped. "You saw Mark," she said. I nodded. He did not know anything. Linda's eyes closed for a second, like she was absorbing a blow she had expected for years. Then she opened them and looked straight at me. "And what does that mean, Daniel?" "It means I made my decision on a rumor," I said. "It means I did not even try to find out what happened." Linda's voice was quiet. "It also means you did not want to." The knife in her hand did not move. The room felt cold despite the warm air from the vents. I swallowed. I did not answer because answering would have required me to say the part that hurt the most. That the lie I never questioned was not about money or school. It was the lie that I was the kind of father who could not be wrong. That night, I went into the garage and took Ethan's old coat off the hook. I held it against my chest, breathing in dust and old detergent. And for the first time in years, I let myself feel the full weight of what I had done. I carried the coat inside and set it on the back of a chair in the living room like a signal to nobody. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, pulled out my phone and scrolled until I found Ethan's number. My thumb hovered over the call button. I did not press it yet. I just sat there listening to the house, listening to Jason laugh faintly in his room, listening to Linda rinse the knife and set it down and wondering what kind of man answers a truth this late. Outside, a car passed on the street tires, whispering on pavement. I looked at Ethan's name on my screen and realized the hardest part was not admitting I was wrong. The hardest part was accepting that he might not want to hear me say it. I stared at the screen until it dimmed and went black. Then I tapped it awake again, like the light might change the outcome. My thumb hovered, and I finally pressed call before I could talk myself out of it. It rang long enough to make my stomach tighten. Then a calm female voice answered, not the standard voicemail greeting that sounded like it belonged to a man who planned his days. "You have reached Ethan Brooks. Leave your name and number." I hung up without speaking. The silence afterward felt like stepping off a curb you thought was there. Linda found me at the table later, sitting with my hands wrapped around a cold mug. She did not say "I told you so." She did not offer comfort. She only asked the one question that mattered. "Did you call?" I nodded. "Did he answer?" "No." Linda set a stack of mail down and slid one envelope toward me. It was addressed to her sister, not to us. She had been handling everything for years, quietly, while I hid behind work. "He may not call back," she said. I looked at the mail and then at her. I know. She studied my face as if she was trying to decide whether this was real or just another mood that would pass. Then she went back to the sink and the water ran, and the sound made the kitchen feel normal again, in a way that hurt. I tried again the next day, and this time I left a message. My voice sounded older than I felt. I kept it short because I did not trust myself not to beg. Ethan, it is Dad. Daniel. I know it has been a long time. I would like to talk if you are willing. Just one conversation. No pressure. I said no pressure like it meant something. Like the weight of 12 years could be lifted with polite words. 2 days later, my phone buzzed while I was in the van outside a supply house on Polaris Parkway. I saw his name and for a second, I forgot how to breathe. One text. Clean and simple. I can meet for coffee. 30 minutes. Saturday at 10. Roosevelt Coffee downtown. No anger. No warmth. Just a schedule. My hands shook so badly, I nearly dropped the phone. I typed back immediately too quickly, like a man afraid the offer would evaporate. Okay. Thank you. Then I sat there with my head against the steering wheel, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, feeling something in me loosen and tighten at the same time. Saturday came with clear skies and cold air, the kind of Ohio morning that looks peaceful and still bites your ears. I drove downtown early and circled twice because I did not know what to do with the extra minutes. The streets were busy with people who had plans. I parked and walked 2 blocks, hands shoved into my coat pockets, heart thumping like I was headed into court. Roosevelt Coffee was warm and bright inside. The smell of espresso hit me hard. I ordered a black coffee because ordering anything else felt like pretending. I chose a table near the window and sat with my back straight, watching the door like it was a storm front. At 10 on the dot, Ethan walked in. He was 28 now, and he looked like a man who had learned to keep his life in order. Dark jacket, clean boots, hair trimmed. He carried himself with quiet confidence, not arrogance. He scanned the room, saw me, and walked over without hesitation. For a second, I stood not sure if we were shaking hands or hugging or doing nothing. Ethan made the decision for both of us. He extended his hand. I took it. His grip was firm, professional. He sat down across from me. "Hi," he said. "Hi," I said back, and my voice nearly cracked. I cleared my throat. "Thank you for coming." He nodded once. 30 minutes. I glanced at the clock on the wall and felt my face burn. I deserved the limit, but it still hurt. I tried to start with an apology, but the words came out wrong at first, too tidy. "I made mistakes, Ethan." He looked at me, eyes steady, and that steadiness made me want to look away. He did not rescue me by filling the silence. He waited. I took a breath. "I was wrong," I said. "About that night. About you. About all of it. I believed a rumor. I wanted to be right more than I wanted to listen. I am sorry." Ethan's expression did not change much. He did not flinch, did not soften. He took in my words like he was reading a report. "Okay," he said. That was it. One syllable. I swallowed. I saw Mark. He admitted he did not know anything. I never should have used that to justify what I did to you. Ethan nodded again, faintly. "I know." "You know," I repeated, confused. He looked down at his hands for the first time. They were clean nails, trimmed the hands of someone who worked with systems more than grease now. He looked back up. "I found out what really happened back then," he said. It was never about missing money at school. A kid lied because he was mad at me. His mom worked the office. She ran with it. It got big for a week, then it died. But you had already made your call. The words hit me like cold water. You could have told me. Ethan's mouth tightened slightly, not in anger, in something closer to disbelief. I tried, he said. I texted you. I begged you to let me explain. You did not answer. I felt my throat close. I did not have a defense that would not sound like a coward's excuse. I was afraid, I admitted. Afraid of being wrong. Afraid of losing control. I thought I was protecting the family. Ethan held my gaze. You were protecting yourself. It was said without heat. That made it worse. I nodded slowly. You are right. A barista called out a name at the counter. Cups clinked. Life kept moving around our small, quiet wreck. I tried to ask about his life because I needed to know, because I wanted to fill the empty years with details like it would make them mine. How is work? I said. Linda told me you have a steady job. He answered with the same calm. It is good. I manage operations for a regional logistics company. It is stable. Are you married? I asked. Then immediately hated myself for making it sound like a checklist. Ethan glanced at the window. Yes. Kids? I asked softer. Not yet. I nodded, trying to act like I was being respectful, but the truth was I was hungry for any crumb. I wanted to ask where he lived, what his wife's name was, whether he still liked baseball, whether he ever thought about the garage and the coat and the model car on his desk. But I could feel a wall, not hostile, just solid. I finally said what I had come to say, the thing that mattered more than my curiosity. I do not expect you to forget. I do not expect anything. I just wanted you to know I see it now. I see what I did, and I am sorry. Ethan's eyes stayed on mine. His voice was quiet. I believe you are sorry. I believe you mean it. Hope rose in me, stupid and bright. Then he continued. But I also have a life. I built it without you. I had to. I am not angry anymore, Dad. I am just careful. I do not want to go backward. The word backward landed like a door closing. I forced myself to nod. I understand. He checked his watch. 10:26. We have a few minutes, he said, and it sounded like a courtesy, not an invitation. I fought the urge to ask for more. I fought the urge to tell him I had changed, that I could be better, that I could earn my way back. I heard Pastor Grant's question again, the one that had started cracking me open years ago. Being right feels clean. Being a father is messy. I realized something then, clear and brutal. The punishment for what I did was not a court case. It was not money. It was not public shame. It was this. Sitting across from my son like a stranger who had been granted an appointment. Ethan stood when his time was up. He offered his hand again. I took it. Take care, he said. You too, I managed. He walked out and the door closed behind him with a soft chime. Not a storm latch. Not a slam. Just a normal sound that somehow felt final. I sat there for a long time after he left, coffee gone cold, watching people come and go, each one carrying their own life like it belonged to them. When I finally got back to my truck, I saw a missed call from Jason. One missed call, then another. I stared at the screen, thinking about the son who had learned to live without me and the son who still assumed I would always pick up. I tapped Jason's name, and before I hit call back, I paused, because for the first time I understood that being a father was not about one grand apology. It was about what you did next with the people still standing in front of you. I hit call back and held the phone to my ear with both hands like it was something fragile. Jason answered on the second ring, voice rushed. "Dad, where are you? I have been calling." I swallowed. "I was downtown. I am on my way." "You sound weird," he said. "Are you okay?" I looked at the steering wheel, then out at the street where people were walking with cups in their hands and nowhere to be ashamed. "I am okay," I said. "I just needed a minute. I will be home soon. Do not worry." I hung up and sat there a few seconds longer, letting the quiet settle. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked older than 52, not because of gray hair, because of something behind my eyes that had finally stopped fighting. When I got home, Jason was in the driveway, leaning against his car keys in his hand, impatience on his face. Linda stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching me approach like she was deciding whether to let me in or let me explain. Jason walked toward me. "You forgot you were picking me up from my shift." My stomach dropped. I had. His call had been about something simple and ordinary, and I had nearly missed it because I was drowning in the past. "I am sorry," I said. "I lost track of time." Jason frowned. "You never lose track of time." He said it like an accusation, but also like fear, as if my attention was a promise he depended on. Linda stepped onto the porch. "Where were you, Daniel?" I took a breath and told the truth, plain and unadorned. "I met Ethan for coffee." Jason's mouth fell open a little. "For real?" Linda did not move. Her eyes searched mine. "Did he talk to you?" "Yes." And she asked. I shook my head once. "Not the way you mean." Jason looked between us, confused. "What does that even mean?" "It means he is doing fine," I said. "He is steady. He is a man now, and he does not need me." Jason's face tightened like the idea offended him. "That is messed up. He is your son." I nodded. "It is messed up. It is also the result of what I did." Jason opened his mouth ready to argue, then hesitated. His anger was real, but it did not know where to land. He turned away and kicked at a small rock on the driveway. Linda stepped closer, voice quieter. "Did you apologize?" "Yes." "Did he forgive you?" I thought about Ethan's calm eyes and the way he said he was not angry anymore, just careful. I thought about the word backward spoken gently, like a boundary line. "He heard me," I said. "That is what I can say. He heard me." Linda exhaled slowly, like she had been holding her breath for 12 years. She did not cry. She did not celebrate. She just nodded once, and I could see the exhaustion in her shoulders. Jason looked at me. "So what now?" I stared at him, my youngest, the one I had kept soft, because it felt safer. The one I had been so proud to protect. I could still feel Ethan's handshake in my palm, firm and distant, a reminder that protection without understanding is just control in a better suit. "Now I pick you up from your shift," I said. "We go eat something. We talk like men. And I do not pretend I am fine when I am not." Jason watched me for a second, then his voice dropped. "Are you going to lose me too?" The question hit me harder than I expected. It was not dramatic. It was honest. It was a boy testing whether a father could be trusted. I stepped closer. "I am not going anywhere," I said. but I have to learn how to be here the right way." He nodded slowly, not convinced, but listening. We drove to a diner off Henderson Road, the kind with worn booths and coffee that tastes like it has been on the burner too long. The waitress called us Han without looking up, and the normalness of it all made my throat tighten. Jason ordered a burger and fries. I ordered meatloaf, something my father used to eat, as if I could borrow his certainty for a night. Halfway through the meal, Jason set his fork down. "So Ethan is married?" I nodded. Did he look happy? I thought about Ethan's polite smile, the steady way he walked through that gym, the ring that caught the light. "Happy is a big word," I said. He looked settled, like he sleeps at night. Jason chewed that over. "He is better than you," he said, then immediately looked guilty. I did not flinch. "Maybe," I said. Or maybe he just learned earlier than I did what matters. Jason stared at his plate. "Why did you do it?" "Back then." "Why did you kick him out?" There are questions you can dodge when your kid is small. When he gets older, the questions come with teeth. I set my hands flat on the table. "Because I was tired," I said. "Because I was scared. Because I wanted control more than I wanted truth. I told myself I was teaching him to be a man. Really, I was protecting my pride." Jason's eyes were fixed on mine. "And Mom?" "Linda was not there, but she was always in the room when we talked about that night." "Your mom was trying to keep the peace," I said. "She did what she knew how to do. But peace that costs you your child is not peace. It is just silence." Jason swallowed. "So what does Ethan want now?" I breathed out slowly. "He wants his life," I said. "The one he built. I do not get to demand a place in it. I do not get to rewrite the past. All I can do is stop making the same kind of mistakes in the present." After dinner, I drove Jason to work for his shift, even though he had a car. He did not argue. Maybe he wanted the ride. Maybe he wanted to feel like he mattered. When I dropped him off, he hesitated before getting out. "Dad." "Yeah. Do you think Ethan will ever come around?" I watched him, my youngest son, with my face and his mother's eyes. I thought about Ethan's boundary and the calm in his voice. I thought about the years I had spent pretending time would fix what only courage could. "I do not know," I said, "and that is the truth. But I know this. If he ever does, it will not be because I pushed. It will be because I finally learned to listen." Jason nodded and stepped out into the fluorescent light of the store entrance, shoulders squared like he was trying on adulthood. At home later, Linda was on the couch with a blanket over her legs, the TV on low. I sat beside her, and for the first time in a long time, I did not try to fill the room with explanations. She looked at me. "Are you okay?" I stared at the quiet living room, at the chair where I had placed Ethan's old coat, at the small, ordinary life that was still here, still waiting for me to act like a man worth staying for. "No," I said softly. "But I am awake now." Linda reached over and took my hand. She did not squeeze it hard. She just held it steady. That is the thing nobody tells you about being a father. Your kids can survive your mistakes. Sometimes they even rise because of them. But you do not get to choose what it costs. The bill comes due in places you cannot pay with money. It comes due in empty seats, missed milestones, and a son who can look you in the eye and say he is fine without you. If you are listening to this and you are a father, or you had a father who mistook control for love, I want to hear from you. Tell me about the moment you realized silence was not peace. Tell me what you did next, or what you wish you had done. And if stories like this matter to you, stay close to this channel. There are more truths worth sitting with, and sometimes the first step toward being better is admitting you have been wrong.